The integumentary system helps to maintain a constant body temperature, protects the body, and provides sensory information about the surrounding environment. Of all of the body's systems, the integumentary system is more easily inspected and exposed to more infection, disease, and injury than any other part of the human body. Although its location makes it vulnerable to damage from trauma, sunlight, bacteria, pollutants, and other things in the environment, the skin also has protective features that ward off such damage. Because of its visibility, the skin reflects our emotions when we frown or we get embarrassed, and some aspects of normal physiology, such as sweating. Changes in skin color may also indicate homeostatic imbalances in the body. For instance, a bluish color of the skin is typically associated with hypoxia or low oxygen. That can be one sign of heart failure, as well as many other disorders, sometimes just being cold or hypothermic. Abnormal skin eruptions or blisters or rashes can indicate chickenpox or cold sores or measles or some other type of systemic infection or diseases in internal organs. Warts, age spots, pimples, some of those are just things you find on the skin. So the skin is important to self-image because that's what people see. So humans spend a great deal of time and money trying to restore the skin and make it appear more youthful or more attractive. So the integumentary system is the skin and the organs found within or coming from the skin, such as the hair, the oil and sweat glands, and the sensory receptors. The study of the skin is known as dermatology. The skin is also known as the cutaneous membrane, as we saw when we covered epithelial tissues. It covers the external surface of the body and is the largest organ of the body when you look at its weight. In humans, the skin can cover up to about 2 square meters or about 22 feet and weighs somewhere around 5 pounds, so about 7% of total body weight. It ranges in thickness depending on where it's located in the skin, typically with the soles of the feet being the thickest and the eyelids being some of the thinnest part of the skin. So we look at some of the major functions of the skin, and it should be obvious that it helps to maintain body temperature by allowing us to keep heat in, but also to get rid of heat when we need to. It helps us to convert inactive vitamin D to its active form so that we can resorb or save calcium from the foods that we eat. It provides sensory information because there's nerve receptors in the skin that help us determine what's going on in the world around us, and helps us to maintain homeostasis in several different ways. When we look at the layers of the skin, we typically divide it into 2 major layers. The epidermis, epi means upon, so that's upon the dermis. So the epidermis is the most superficial layer, and then the dermis is the deeper layer. So the epidermis is what we see when we look at the skin. The dermis is just below that. Now you may hear that there are 3 layers to the skin. However, that 3rd layer is the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer, and it's not technically a layer of the skin. It's composed of areolar connective tissues and adipose tissue, and a lot of times it's covered as in we study it with the skin, but it's not officially a layer of the skin. So here you see an image that shows the 2 layers of the integumentary system. Let's begin here with the outermost layer. This is the epidermis. Here is the dermis, and here is the subcutaneous or hypodermis. Now remember, the hypodermis is not technically a part of the skin, but it's found below, and it is sort of between the skin, I guess you would say, and the underlying muscle. So made up of lots and lots of adipose tissue, and some of the blood vessels, or the blood vessels that go to the dermis, run through the hypodermis. Wait a minute, back up, there we go. So the epidermis is also composed of many different layers that we're going to look at, and we'll see some of the structures and characteristics of those different layers. In the dermis, you see this is where our hair follicles, where our hair grows from, and we've got glands such as sweat glands and sebaceous glands and many different things that we'll look at as a part of that. You'll see more of these structures, of course, when you look at the skin structure in lab, so we'll just get a brief overview of what some of them are at this point. So if you look at the histology of the skin, here you see a cross section through the skin. Here's a hair shaft growing from a hair follicle. Here you can see a sebaceous gland that's going to secrete oil into that. All of this external part out here is your epidermis, and then you've got your dermis. Okay, so your dermis is going to be further divided into areas that we'll see, but you can see how the connective tissue that makes up the dermis is running in many different directions. Remember when we did tissues, we looked at the irregular connective tissue. So here you see an example of that. So this is hair, or this is skin with hair, such as you would find located on many areas of the body, and in fact most areas of the body except for the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand. Here you see another view of the skin, and this is without hair, and this would be an example of the type of skin that you would find on the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand. So many of the layers look very similar, but we have an additional layer that we'll talk about when we look at the epidermal layers, and of course you don't have the hairs growing from the hair follicles in this area. What you can see here is how the dermis is sort of projecting up in a finger-like projection called a papillae into the epidermis. When that happens, it forms areas that we call epidermal ridges, and they're made from where the dermis just sort of pokes up into the epidermis, and this is what gives us the pattern of our fingerprints. And here you simply see a photomicrograph of some of the layers of the skin, and you can see how the layers do appear very different. Now these areas and different layers and appearance will make a little more sense to you after we do a little bit more study and talk about the different layers and the cells that make them up. So in the epidermis, we have four major types of cells that will be found: keratinocytes, melanocytes, macrophages, and tactile epithelial cells known as Merkel cells. So the epidermis is composed of keratinized, goodness, that word doesn't want to come out, keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelial. So that tells us there's something in there called keratin, and there's a whole bunch of layers, stratified and squamous, flat epithelial cells containing these four major types of cells. The keratinocytes produce the protein keratin. That keratin is going to help protect the skin and the underlying tissues from heat and foreign bacteria and chemicals, and also produces these little granules that are somewhat lamellar or provide a covering, which gives us sort of a waterproof sealant that regulates how much water gets in and out of the body. The melanocytes are going to produce the pigment melanin, which contributes to skin color. But the melanin is also really important in that it helps to provide a protection for the cells that are underneath the melanin from UV radiation. Our skin is always exposed to the sunlight, and of course UV radiation being a part of that, the melanin sort of forms an umbrella over the cells that are beneath it, and thus protects those cells from UV radiation damage. The macrophages, or also called the Langerhans cells, are going to be a part of the immune response and help to get rid of bacteria and broken down cells and other things that might be found in the epidermis. And then the tactile or Merkel cells contact a little sensory structure called a tactile or Merkel disc, and that functions in the sensation of touch in the superficial layers of the skin. So the epidermis is made up of two types of skin. Again, I mentioned this just briefly a while ago. The thin skin, or where the hairs are formed, covers all of the body except the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and the surface of our digits, our fingers and thumbs. The thick skin, the hairless skin, covers those areas, the palms, the surfaces of the digits, and the soles. So when we start looking at the epidermis and further look at the layers that make up the epidermis, we have 4 layers in all of the epidermis and 5 layers present in thick skin. So beginning from the deepest layer, they are the stratum basale, the base layer, the stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidum, which we only find in the thick skin, and the stratum corneum. Alright, so let's look at each of these layers in a little more detail. Here you can see we are looking at the thick skin, so we're going to have all 5 layers. So this is the most superficial layer, which is, of course, that stratum corneum. This is the layer that we see when we look at our skin. All these cells are dead. Then we have the stratum lucidum, which is the layer that's only found in thick skin, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, which is a very thick layer, and then the stratum basale, the base layer. So the stratum basale is going to be the epithelial layer that is connected to the basement membrane, and then of course we have the connective tissues that are going to form the dermis. So let's look just a little bit at a description of each of these layers. So the deepest layer of the epidermis is the stratum basale. It's composed of a single layer of keratinocytes, so keratin cells. Some of the cells in this layer are stem cells that are constantly undergoing mitosis or cell division to produce new cells. So the nuclei of these keratinocytes in the stratum basale are very large. Their cytoplasm has a lot of ribosomes or protein-making machinery in there. Also a part of this, you have keratin intermediate filaments. So keratin is that protein that's going to help provide this waterproofing layer. You have the melanocytes that are going to be located in the stratum basale, and the melanocytes are the cells that are going to produce the skin pigment melanin. And also you've got epithelial cells for tactile reception, or the sensation of touch, are going to be located within the stratum basale. You may sometimes hear this called the stratum germinativum. To germinate means to sprout. So this sort of indicates the role of this layer in creating new cells. The stratum spinosum is the next layer toward the surface. So the stratum basale is the base. The stratum spinosum is 8 to 10 rows of keratinocytes that are filled with those keratin bundles. They contain little projections, or this layer contains the projections of melanocytes, and this is where some of the melanin gets stored, and also where some of those macrophages are found as well. So in the stratum spinosum, in the human body, the cells look differently in the living tissue than they do when we take a piece of that epidermis and we put it on a microscope slide. So remember, once you take the tissue out of the body, it's not going to be living tissue. So in the spinosum, the cells are attached together with a lot of desmosomes. So this gives a very tough cells being held together very tightly so that they don't pull apart. Well, that's all well and good in living tissue, but once you take that tissue out and you put it on a microscope slide, those cells start dying, but those desmosomes still hold together. So the cells very often will appear very spiky as those cells are pulling against each other when we're putting them on a microscope slide. So that's how the name spinosum came about with this layer of cells. The stratum granulosum, usually about 3 to 5 layers of flattened keratinocytes. The organelles in this layer are beginning to degenerate because the cells are getting further and further and further away from that vascular supply that we find in the connective tissues of the dermis. So as new cells are being created, the older cells are being pushed farther and farther and farther toward the surface of the skin. So they're getting farther and farther away from that vascular supply, and by doing so, farther and farther away from the nutrients and the oxygen. So these cells start to degenerate, but also they have lots and lots of little granules containing the protein keratin and a lot of lipids, which help us to really provide, or helps your skin to really provide that waterproofing layer. The stratum lucidum is only present in the thick skin. So the cells here are dead. but they still contain a large amount of keratin. The thicker the skin, the more stratum lucidum that we have. But again, these cells are only going to be present in the thick skin. And the reason that these cells are called lucidum, lucid means clear. So they're starting to lose a lot of the organelles because they're dead. And because of that, the stain is taken up differently in the cells in this area. So they typically don't take up a lot of stain. So lucid means clear. So they appear sort of a pale area when you're looking at the different layers. And then the stratum corneum, it can be just a few layers of cells, or it can be 50 or more layers of dead, flat keratinocytes that contain mostly keratin and nothing else. So the stratum corneum is the part of the skin that we see. It's the outer layer. And these are the cells that are constantly being sloughed off because there's dead. All their cell junctions have disintegrated, so there's really nothing left there to hold those cells together, so they're constantly coming off. And this is a lot of what creates dust in your house. And if you really want to be grossed out, vacuum your mattress, and a lot of what you're pulling up is going to be dead skin cells, and it's really gross, I promise. All right, before we move into the dermis, I want to add a couple of things that are important clinically here about the epidermis. So, new skin cells can't regenerate if an injury causes enough destruction of the tissue. And if the epidermis base layer, the stratum basale, is destroyed and all the stem cells in that area are destroyed, then the skin can't regenerate itself. So sometimes when there is a massive injury to the epidermis, such as with a burn, a skin graft is required in order for that tissue to heal. A skin graft is simply the transfer of a patch of healthy skin taken from a donor site to cover a wound. It may be used from one part of the body to another part, or we may have to go outside the body to a donor to get that skin. So a skin graft is going to be performed, of course, because we want to protect the underlying tissues. We want to promote the healing of the tissues and prevent fluid loss, try to help reduce the formation of scarring, which can lead to, of course, the loss of function of that tissue. And then there's always the cosmetic reason. Everyone wants their skin to appear attractive. So to avoid tissue rejection, the transplanted skin is usually going to be taken from the same individual, and that's what we call an autograft. Auto means self. So taking the skin from one part of the body to put onto a damaged area. This is usually very successful because the immune system doesn't recognize those cells as being foreign. The second best option would be from an identical twin. Identical twins have identical genes. Therefore, their immune system wouldn't recognize those cells as being foreign, and the person needing the skin graft would be much more likely to accept it and the immune system not destroy it. The skin is so extensive that an autograft would sometimes cause harm. A self-donation procedure called an autologous skin transplantation might be used. In this procedure, and this is mostly only going to be performed in severely burned patients, a small amount of the individual's epidermis is removed, and the keratinocytes are cultured or grown in the laboratory, and then they can grow thin sheets of skin. The new skin can then be transplanted back to the patient so that it covers the wound and generates a permanent new skin. Another thing that's pretty cool is new skin grafts sometimes that are used for wound coverage are made from products that are grown in the laboratory that are simply made from the foreskins of uncircumcised or from circumcised infants. So growing new skin from donor skin. So there's a lot of really cool things going on. I just thought this was a good place to bring that in. Another thing I want to briefly talk about is keratinization of the skin. So keratinization and growth of the epidermis. Remember, those cells are in layers upon layers upon layers, so newly formed cells in the stratum basale are slowly pushed to the surface. As the cells move from one epidermal layer to the other, they accumulate more and more of the keratin. This process is called keratinization. And then they start undergoing apoptosis. Apoptosis is like a naturally occurring cell death. Eventually, the keratinized cells are going to slough off, and they're going to be replaced by underlying cells that are also going to become keratinized. So the whole process by which these cells form in the stratum basale and rise to the surface, become keratinized, and slough off takes about 4 to 6 weeks in the average epidermis. Nutrients and oxygen are going to diffuse to the avascular epidermis from the blood vessels in the dermis. The epidermal cells in the stratum basale are closer to all these blood vessels, so they get more of the nutrients, they get more of the oxygen. These cells are going to be the most active metabolically, and they're continuously undergoing cell division or mitosis and creating new cells. So as these new cells are being created, they're pushing the cells above them closer and closer and closer to the surface, but further and further and further away from the blood supply, the nutrients, so they're becoming less active and they eventually die. There's a clinical condition I want to bring in here called psoriasis. It's a very common and chronic skin disorder in which the keratinocytes divide and move more quickly than normal from the stratum basale up to the stratum corneum. They're usually shed in as little as 7 to 10 days. The immature keratinocytes make an abnormal protein, an abnormal keratin, which forms sort of flaky, silvery-looking scales at the surface, most often found at the knees and the elbow and the scalp in the form of dandruff. Effective treatments often include ointments that you can put on, and also ultraviolet phototherapy, which suppresses the cell division and therefore, of course, suppresses the rate at which those cells are being created. All right, I think we'll stop here and start a new video for the dermis.